Last week, former SNC-Lavalin executive Ben Aissa pleaded guilty to charges of bribery, money laundering and corruption. He and several others, including former SNC CEO Pierre Duhem, are alleged to have committed fraud of $22.5 million, all over a $1.3 billion contract. Canada, though, is improving its reputation for battling bribery and corruption among corporations abroad. This is according to anti-corruption watchdog Transparency International Canada. Every year, Transparency International monitors the compliance of 41 signatory countries to an anti-bribery convention. The OECD convention prohibits bribes to win contracts and dodge taxes or local laws. Transparency tied Canada's modest improvement to Ottawa's amendments to the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act and increased enforcement from the RCMP. Last year, Griffiths Energy International was convicted and fined $10.35 million under the Act. Transparency also points to the extradition of the former senior SNC-Lavalin Group executive as a clear sign Canada is taking bribery abroad seriously. The watchdog is urging Canada to join the U.S., Germany, UK and Switzerland in becoming more active enforcers of the rules. Peter Dent is Chair and President of Transparency International Canada. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Amanda.
So we called it a modest improvement. Just characterize how we're doing, because when we think, of course, SNC looms large, we became known internationally and shut out of some project bids as a result. What does this improvement look like?
Well, you've got 4 active enforcement countries, which are the U.S., the UK, Germany, and Switzerland.
Yeah.
And you can see, just look across the border, you see how active the U.S. is. They have, a couple of dozen of active investigations ongoing right now. Canada has a handful of active, well-known investigations ongoing right now. And it was just this year that we moved from little or limited enforcement up to the category of moderate enforcement. So we are seeing some improvement.
And why is it important that we be seen to be in that active category, that we be seen to be good players on this front?
Well, I think that it's important for Canadian companies that how they're doing business is being monitored within the country in which they're operating, and that they're not just looking south towards the United States and worrying about how they might be enforced if they run afoul of the FCPA rules down there. But also, it's also a measure to protect Canadian companies from engaging in inappropriate activities overseas. I
think there's a sense that global trade is furthered by a reduction in corruption and bribery. Do we know that to be true? Does trade get better or easier for businesses when countries are persuaded to enforce these kinds of laws?
It would, if everybody was enforcing the laws, because you would have more predictability when you're conducting business overseas.
Right.
And businesses want predictability, so they want a level playing field.
So let's talk about then the things that Canada did do. They do sound sort of modest, and because they were focused on 1 or 2 big incidences, in your view, has Canada changed its thinking about this? Are we more stringent today than we were 2 years ago?
Well, we do have the improvements to the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act. We also have very recently the integrity provisions of the Public Works website as well, in terms of federal government procurement. So therefore, there are steps that are being taken in Canada that are viewed as being very forceful globally. One
of the arguments that you hear made by companies is it's very difficult to go to a place and play by a higher set of standards than anybody else when there is low level, and I don't think anybody would say they're engaging in corruption or even bribery, but there's a variety of forms of this behavior that under our rules they're simply not allowed to engage in, and then it becomes difficult for them to win the bid, get the contract. What do you say to those people when they say we're not making it fair for them?
It's a common argument that we hear, but we see this legislation and compliance programs as protecting companies in those sorts of situations. It's a slippery slope. Once you say yes to that first bribe, how do you say no to the next one? And when the rules change on the ground, who do you take it up with? Who are you complaining to that the bribes have become too much? You're trapped within that environment. And then all of a sudden, a very profitable contract becomes very unprofitable.
So were you shocked? Are you shocked when you see big incidences of bribery or corruption? We've obviously had all the allegations at SAC. Is this commonplace in the world today that it leaves you unshocked?
I'm not shocked by the number of allegations that we have. I mean, you look at the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, and you see how much of the world is categorized as red or very dark red, which is the highest risk categories. So it shouldn't be surprising that we see companies running afoul of procurement guidelines or procurement rules in foreign jurisdictions with very high corruption risk.
What's the best way to persuade a country that isn't very active? And I think we could take anything from a huge country like China to some smaller places. What's the best way to persuade them to get on board?
I think the best way to persuade them is basically persuasion of governments like Canada, the United States, and the UK to say, we want more transparency in terms of how you're conducting procurement. When we're enforcing our legislation against companies that are accepting or providing bribes, you're enforcing your legislation against the public officials that are accepting them. And that's really key to the Transparency International's no impunity program that we're operating right now.
All right, we got to leave it there. Peter, we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Amanda.